think actually it's really important that we do have open conversations with people on both sides, if you like, so we understand, what our faith is grounded on.
There have been times, like John mentioned, especially with the rise of new atheism, where being a Christian in a scientific workplace can be challenging.
Welcome to another episode of Postcards from Antioch. This is our Barton Church teaching, discipleship and leadership podcast where we invite different people to speak into these topics and help us think through how to follow Jesus. And today we have two guests, John, hello, and Kevin, hello. Good to have you with us.
Hello, yeah, good to be here.
Good. And you're both members of the church and have been for a while. And you also work in the area, the field of science. So we're going to be thinking today about faith and science and whether that's okay. How does that work? And just hearing from your life story, really, in your field of work, but also in other areas of your life that are relevant to this topic. But I thought we'd start with a really important question just to get us warmed up. Are you a tea or coffee drinker? That's the first. What do you go for, John?
I'm a coffee drinker, definitely. Yeah, I've never really understood tea, I guess. But no, yeah, I like a coffee, probably 2 or 3 a day.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So only coffee. And Kevin, bit of both?
Bit of both, yeah. Probably equal numbers of tea and coffee across the course of a day.
Yeah, I'm similar to that as well. Yeah, love them both. But where I'm going with this is there must be a scientific perfect tea. I think there was an article I read about a year ago on this, but I'd love as scientists to hear what you think makes the perfect coffee, John, or the perfect tea. Come on, give us your best.
Okay, so I actually used to work with someone when I used to work at Imperial College who bought basically a kettle, but it would heat the water to exactly 95 degrees. So it wouldn't go above that because apparently when you're brewing coffee, that is particularly bad. So I think that's probably the optimal temperature for the water. And then if you're doing a cafetiere, you get the right amount. Obviously, that's really important of coffee to add. You brew it. I brew it for 4 minutes in the cafetiere. Filter it carefully. You don't double pour. It's bad to do that. You pour it in a single pour. Never go back. And then obviously, if you want to add sugar and to taste and give it a good stir, done.
Wow, I'd expect nothing less. Such a precise technique. I'm sure there's a timer. There's all sorts. Very good. And how about the perfect cup of tea? What do you think?
We bought a new bit of kit in the lab at the university a few years ago, and when I went on a training course for this particular piece of kit, we did some experiments on tea because it was in the room next door to where we were looking at the instrumentation, and we brewed several cups of tea and we took a sample after 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, all the way up to 5 minutes, I think it was, and the optimum time is between 3 and 5 minutes. But then you get into this argument about milk first or second.
Yes.
And I think that's a personal taste. Some people prefer the flavour when they add the milk into the hot tea, and other people prefer it the other way around. And we could discuss why that is. You get slightly different changes in the structures of the proteins in the milk, depending on which way you add and other flavour compounds, the way you add the tea to the milk or the milk to the tea. And that's a personal taste thing. What you shouldn't do is, if you're going to take tea in a flask, is add the milk and then put it in the flask for more than maybe 15 minutes, because then the milk seriously gets tainted and the taste deteriorates very rapidly.
So that's why it doesn't taste as good in a flask.
That is why.
That has now answered that quandary of mine. Yeah. There we go. Right. Always just best fresh, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, from important things like tea and coffee into your journey into science maybe, and into work and that profession, and also as Christians, how that looks. So maybe John and Kevin, some background would be helpful for people. John, maybe you kick us off. How did you come to be both a scientist and a Christian? Because sometimes we can feel like there's a conflict there. So you start us off, please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I grew up in a Christian household. So kind of from early age I went to church. I went to a Baptist church back in Birmingham. But my dad's also a science teacher, or was a science teacher. So he was a kind of chemist, grew up in that field. So I always kind of had, I guess, a role model who was a Christian, man of faith, but also a scientist. But I was kind of reflecting back on this and thinking, actually, we didn't, at the time when I was younger, I didn't really have too many, at least deep conversations about issues that kind of where science and faith might intersect or might differ too much. And it's only really probably in the last few years since I've looked into it a bit more that I've kind of started to have those conversations with him. But yeah, so I think growing up, I kind of had a kind of obviously the background of the faith growing up in church, but also pursuing science, going to university, studying chemistry, and then subsequently doing a PhD. I had that kind of.
What was your PhD in?
It was in laser spectroscopy, which is kind of a branch between chemistry and physics. Okay. So there was always that kind of science kind of embedded into my life as I progressed through my career. But I think there was times, particularly when I went to university as an undergraduate, where I was kind of a little bit, I wouldn't say lost, but there was times when I was trying to really, I probably was thinking about those kind of issues of science and maybe aspects of faith kind of bubbling under the surface, but I didn't really necessarily take them too seriously, and I kind of perhaps even shrugged them off. You almost like didn't even want to think about them. Yeah. But then subsequently after that, when I was kind of doing my PhD, and then subsequently after that, I guess maybe similar to what we've been talking about recently, taking my faith a bit more seriously, taking God more seriously, and I subsequently was baptized. That was when I really started to dig in and see, how can I make sense of this for myself? How can I understand how that intersection between science and faith works? And then even more so probably in the last kind of 10 years when I've been looking into more apologetics type things and listening to big thinkers, I guess, on both sides, both the kind of atheist, kind of Richard Dawkins types, and then the kind of Christian scientists like John Lennox, for example, and seeing how they've kind of debated and the kind of issues surrounding that, I've really started to kind of, I guess, gain a bit more confidence in terms of understanding, that I believe that those things can kind of coexist, if you like, and also just, other role models, both kind of, historically within science, people like Isaac Newton, very famous example. Christian scientist, but also more recently there are plenty of kind of world leading scientists. So there's one chemist, a guy called John B. Goodenough, which is a slightly strange name, but he kind of come to fame through the development of a lot of lithium-ion batteries, and he's a devout Christian and a great role model, I think, for kind of those ideas of science and faith. So I think through those role models, I've kind of come to appreciate the kind of coexistence, and it's driven me to kind of understand and kind of look a bit more detail into these kind of issues.
Okay, great. That's helpful to know. Thank you. How about yourself, Kevin?
Well, I didn't grow up in a Christian family, and I didn't become a Christian until I was 15, although I started going to church maybe 1 or 2 years before that. But always had a fascination for how things work. My dad was an engineer, so he used to work for an aircraft company called Armstrong Whitworth, I believe it was, who were based in Coventry in the late 50s and early 60s. And then when that closed, he then went and worked for a motor company called Standard, who later became Triumph, and then British Leyland. And so there's always been this sort of engineering and DIYing. My dad did a lot of stuff around the house, and I was used to sort of follow him around and hand him his tools and things and watch what he was doing and help him when he was fixing the cars and things. And so I developed a fascination in how things work. It amuses my parents still to this day that the university let me anywhere near expensive bits of kit. I have a £500,000 mass spectrometer in the lab when I go up to the university, and if it goes wrong, I'll think nothing of taking the side panels off and taking bits out and putting it back together.
You're a brave man.
And getting it working again. This horrifies my parents because when I was younger, we had a record player at home, which I decided I would take to pieces to see how it worked. It never worked again.
Oh dear.
I always wanted a chemistry set as a kid growing up. When you'd get the Argos catalogue and, you know, what would you like for your birthday or Christmas? I'd love a chemistry set. No, we're not buying a chemistry set. You'll blow yourself up. Eventually, I go off to university, study chemistry, and I still haven't blown myself up. So if you're watching, Mum and Dad, sorry. On the faith side of things, I started at secondary school, got given a Gideon New Testament, I think in my second year of secondary school, started reading it. It was interesting. And then not long after that, my mum and sister went off to a wedding, and my sister, who's younger than me, was really taken with the minister at the Anglican church they went to. So my mum and sister decided to go back on a Sunday, just to see what the church was like, and for want of something better to do, I'm an early bird rather than a night owl, so I'm always up early in the morning. So on a Sunday morning back in the day, I would be up. There was no daytime or Sunday morning TV back in those days. It's like, well, what do you do with yourself? So I thought, I'll tag along. Went along to church, and I probably went along to church for a couple of years, learnt more about the Bible and what it teaches. But it wasn't until I went on a Christian camp as a 15-year-old, and then we had a series of talks that went through how, you know, everything was created by God. There's a science link there, I guess, in some senses, and that is something that's been discussed in previous podcasts. And the fall, and how we're all sinners, and then how Christ came and how his death paved the way for us to be reconciled with our Heavenly Father, and it all just sort of clicked. And
wow, excellent.
Became a Christian then. So Easter 1979 as a 15-year-old.
Yeah.
So a few years ago now.
Yeah, a few years ago now. And you have just retired, is that right?
Long story short, yeah, I took early retirement just coming up 2 years ago, but I work in quite a niche area, and for various reasons, the university at the moment haven't replaced me directly with a like-for-like appointment. So I go in on an ad hoc basis to help out.
To play around with expensive machinery. And
so very often it's, Kevin, something's not working, and I get to go in and take these very expensive bits of kit to pieces and put them back together again.
Well, that's an important job, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yes, we're very grateful.
Yeah. and I presume you did a PhD.
No,
you didn't.
I don't have a PhD. So I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Kent. Then I worked for a year in the chemistry department, so I have a chemistry degree as well, same as John. And then there was only money for 1 year in that role. So when that money ran out, I then got a job at what is now Cancer Research UK, had a different name back then. And I spent 4 years working in an immunology lab, so a mixture of so lots of biology going on in the lab, but I was working as a chemist in that environment. But it really opened up a whole world of opportunities, literally. So I then left Cancer Research UK, went to work at Pfizer. From Pfizer, I've been and worked out in the US. I've been and done stuff in Indonesia, and then from Pfizer, ended up back at the University of Kent, where I did my degree as an undergraduate, but in biosciences rather than chemistry.
There we go. Wow. So you've both got a vast experience in the university academic setting as chemists and similar fields, in a teaching capacity as well as a technical research capacity. And so I wondered, in that role, has that ever been hard to believe in God? Have you ever found yourself thinking, oh, does it really make sense? Where has there ever been a moment or a time when you were particularly tested, given the approach that you've just described? John or Kevin, either of you.
I mean, I think it would be slightly unusual if there hadn't been a time where there had at least been times where I should have questioned what I believe. And I think actually it's really important that we do have open conversations with people on both sides, if you like. So so we understand, what our faith is grounded on ultimately. So yeah, I think there's been times when certain topics have come up. I think particularly for me, I was kind of at university where the kind of new atheist movement really started to take hold in the UK, particularly with a lot of media coverage and Richard Dawkins' books in particular were coming out. And I think that was in some ways quite a difficult time. And I think probably in that period, one of the reasons why I was possibly a lot more hesitant to actually talk more openly, maybe, with people that I work with, knowing that some of them probably did have I knew some of them did have quite strong views. And at that point, probably I didn't really feel equipped to actually answer some of their difficult questions and felt like I would represent my faith well. So I think there is a challenge there. And this is one of the reasons why now I've tried to look a bit more into it and try to understand a bit more, so I can have a reason to say what my faith is and why I believe what I believe, which I think is important.
So this is kind of, and I think that's a big kind of at the heart of this podcast. Really, is this whole desire is to equip people to get us thinking, being honest and open, and also going, I can be prepared to not just remain silent, but speak in with confidence and maybe challenge people in a loving way. That's great. So you're being quite honest there. There were points, but you've kind of grown and feel more able to engage in those discussions.
Yeah. And I think nowadays we're very lucky in the age of the internet in some senses that there are a lot more resources that are very freely and easily available to people if you know where to look. You've got to be a little bit careful perhaps with certain kind of biases with everything. But I think there is a lot more out there, and I think the conversation since that new atheist movement has moved on. There are a lot more kind of more open perspectives now, and actually a lot of the kind of inferences that you see online that are quite stringent atheists, but they are much more open to have these kind of conversations with kind of Christian thinkers and various things that are not as rigid perhaps as probably some of their predecessors were.
Yeah. Okay, and Kevin, what do you think about this whole area of? Do you think it's harder for a scientist to believe in God, and what might have been some of the challenges that you've experienced along the way?
I think for me personally, I guess most Christians have doubts, and I've probably had similar doubts to the majority of Christians. I don't think there's been anything in the science that I've done that has made me doubt my beliefs, but there have been times, like John mentioned, especially with the rise of new atheism, where being a Christian in a scientific workplace can be challenging, because being open, or there was a time where being open about your faith would mean that some scientists wouldn't take you seriously.
Yeah. Okay. It's hard. Yeah.
Yeah. So they if you believe in God, then you can't really be a serious scientist. And so then when you're involved in discussions and things, and you're sharing a point of view, a scientific point of view, that may not be quite paralleled with the other person's point of view, their thinking of you is tainted by the fact that they know you believe in God, and therefore
that in theory might block your career development or your comfort in the workplace to be who you are without facing a bit of minor kind of opposition.
Yeah. I think this is still fairly prevalent as well. There are still fields where that the kind of naturalistic, materialistic approach is almost a given. And actually I've heard of stories where there's been people who have tried to publish particular types of research that have looked into particular, perhaps slightly more controversial questions. And one of the ones I was listening to recently was kind of research that had been done into basically effectively miraculous healing type events, and looking into the science and actually saying, look, we've collected this evidence from various medical records, and there are experienced people that have looked at this, and we're presenting this as a case for this could be miraculous healing. But actually a lot of those have been rejected from the kind of higher impact journals because those editors don't want to take a risk effectively on publishing that
and lose credibility
and lose the potential credibility
Yeah.
because there is still amongst, I think, certain parts of the scientific community that resistance to, we can't let anything in that isn't, very rigid naturalistic materialistic science, because it's that kind of, you give an inch and you take a mile kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of caution still within some.
And I guess on the popular level, even not in the scientific academic sense, there might be the throwaway comments you might experience down the pub or at the social setting, whatever you're in, of how on earth you really think Jesus could walk on water? He could just create enough food for 5,000 from all the rest, and that level of, come on, you're a scientist, prove it. And you say, so I guess, have you ever encountered those kind of statements?
Yeah, a little bit. I think, well, I don't know if you've got any particular examples, Kevin.
There's a guy who I still meet very regularly. We go out and we have a beer together, who used to take great joy at tea breaks when anybody new joined and came and sat down at the table we used to sit at. Tea times at the university have changed a lot in the last 10, 15 years, but so we're going back a little bit. But he would always take great joy in telling everybody I was a Christian. I never had to out myself as a Christian because my mate did it for me. And I think he always hoped that people were going to bombard him with questions. And surprisingly, actually, most people were quite respectful in that more informal setting. So sometimes there'd be a bit of banter rather than people seriously saying, well, come on, prove it. It became much more...
Well, they don't want to get into an argument with... Well, I guess if they're a scientist, they maybe can go toe-to-toe. But I guess your Joe Public that isn't is going to quickly come out unstuck. And so, maybe just moving on a little bit. During your Christian journey, John, have you ever had issues that you found hard to reconcile with your scientific understanding? Maybe there's a few roadblocks in the Bible that have been hard, or something that's just been a bit, we won't know until that's the bit where faith really is getting exercised. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there are obviously challenging passages in the Bible generally. I mean, particularly in the Old Testament where you have the kind of genocidal type events. But I think in terms of a scientific point of view, I think miracles is an area where I think that is challenging. And I think that's just often true. So, because, I mean, for me at least, I believe that the world works with some laws of nature, and they describe what we observe very well. But of course, miracles effectively, they are by definition a supernatural event, so they step outside of those laws of nature. And so there's a little bit of tension there, and how will you reconcile that? And I think that's a lot of kind of pushback we might get from atheists or agnostics when they say, you can't have this where you believe that God created this amazing universe and set these laws in place and perfectly fine-tuned this. And then you can also say that, but he can just break those laws when he wants to. It's kind of like trying to have your cake and eat it type of thing. And that is difficult. I think it is difficult to sometimes reconcile that. But I think that's a kind of tension that you kind of have to reconcile within yourself to a certain extent, in the sense that you've got to believe to a certain extent that if you're believing in a God who is all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful, then yes, he is going to have a bigger picture of the universe, of the way it be, and why he may choose to intervene at particular times. That's right. So I think I kind of refer back to the kind of recent kind of evidence of current miracles. I think there's still a lot of skepticism. What was interesting on this particular podcast I was listening to, there was one of the panel members was a Christian who had been healed at a very young age through, at the time, what was considered miraculous healing. But he didn't believe it. And he believed that there was a reasonable medical explanation. But he believes in miracles that were done by Jesus, for example. So there's still a tension to it. Some people will believe that miracles point to Jesus in the sense that only he can induce that and govern when that happens. The
Son of God speak and things are created in a sense that you would expect, if you believe in God, to be able to do. Quite different today through prayer or a Christian in an act that is miraculous. Is that
yeah,
what you're
exactly.
saying?
Yeah. So, and I think he was always trying to push back on this kind of like, well, there's got to be some kind of psychosomatic kind of reason why this person's been healed, or they've been misdiagnosed, or this kind of thing. And it was very interesting that they were providing a lot of very clear medical evidence to say that actually they've tried to look at these cases and said, well, this isn't really a good representation. So I think there's uncertainty still with kind of, can miracles still happen today? And that's probably another podcast in itself. But
we'll solve that one next time.
Yeah. But I think that's probably one of the main areas that I find a little bit more challenging to reconcile. And I'm still, I guess, probably working through that to a certain extent.
Okay, Kevin, any areas that you struggle a bit more to reconcile? Got it all solved and sorted by now? Hey?
I wish. I mean, as I won't add anything to what John said in relation to miracles. There are things that I read in the scripture, and then there are things in science that I guess I find difficult to reconcile. And to my shame, I haven't listened to your previous podcast, so I need to go away and listen to it. And I don't want to go into lots of detail about something that you may have covered already. But evolution is an interesting area. Understatement. And then you've got organizations like Answers in Genesis with their teaching that there must be a first Adam, if Christ is a type of Adam. But I have big issues with evolution as well. So if we start getting into population genetics and the minimum number of a species that you need for it to be able to survive and reproduce without the deleterious effects of interbreeding and so on. And I'm beginning to get very scientific and open up a whole kind of worms I don't really want to go down necessarily now. But anyone who's watching wants to talk to me about these things, I'm happy to talk about them. There are...
certain things that are harder to reconcile from those creation accounts. And... some of which we touched on, many of which we probably dodged. But yeah, I think that's really helpful to hear that you can be a Christian and a scientist and work in science and have a love for understanding how things work, and also at the same time acknowledge, this is a bit hard to figure out, to comprehend, be that miracles, the creation, evolution, fine-tuning of the universe, intelligent design, all these things. And that's why there's lots of podcast books. And what therefore is important for Christians listening that aren't scientists, what could we take away as being helpful, given that you can have a love for science, of course, but it can't answer everything. What advice would you give to some of our listeners in this?
So I'm in the middle of listening to a series of podcasts by a guy called Justin Brearley, and I'm going to have to put my glasses on just to make sure that I give you the title of the podcast correctly. It's called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God.
Yeah, I think we've referred to this before so this is a good one. Yeah. Well done. I'm enjoying it too.
So that's definitely worth a listen, and it discusses some of the things like new atheism. And then I'm also currently in the middle of reading a book which came to my attention through that particular podcast by somebody called Jeremiah Johnson, called Body of Proof. And this is about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So in his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins is a bit disingenuous because he talks about not all ancient historians believe that Jesus was a historic figure, and that there's a professor in some university that doesn't think it's the case. But actually this professor is not a professor of history. He's had subsequent editions of his book republished, but without correcting that misleading statement, which he accepts and he's said publicly is misleading. So this book by Jeremiah Johnson is very interesting because it talks about, Jesus was a real person. He he was crucified, he died, what happened next? And this book looks at that evidence, and it's based around his PhD thesis, and now at one of the Oxbridge universities, and I'm not going to say which one in case I get it wrong. But so it's not a thesis that was written for some Christian college in the US. This is for
and is that accessible? Is it a read that some of our listeners could engage with?
Oh yes, very much.
Okay, so it's not.
And it's not a very expensive book either.
Yeah.
I've got it as a Kindle book, and it's not a long read either.
Great. So one bit of advice would be engage with the stuff that's out there. Some really good stuff out there, podcasts and books. John, anything to add?
Justin Braley's the kind of host of the Unbelievable Postcards, which I think I highlighted last time. And there's so many really great accessible discussions on there around topics of science and faith. So I think that's often my kind of go-to, and he's very good at mediating those discussions, so it is accessible. So I would say that's good. And I think just doing a little bit of looking, and you can do this online, about people's testimonies. I think ultimately that can be really helpful, because although we can understand the kind of nitty gritty, if you like, of how the science and the faith might fit together, actually I think you can learn a lot through other people's testimonies and how they came to faith and how they come to reconcile those issues around. And I think that it can be a very personal thing. And I think by understanding different people's views and opinions and how their journey progressed, that can be really helpful in kind of understanding how it might work for yourself. And maybe you might differ in certain aspects, but that's okay. I mean, I think we're encouraged in the Bible to think for ourselves, right? We search and we find. We're always asked to do that. And I think if we're doing that in a genuine way through both research, but also prayer and meditation, all those kind of good things that we do as Christians, I think that's that's the way we will ultimately get to that place where we can understand more and be therefore make it a bit easier to talk to other people about these things as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I think just to kind of pull some of that together, just listening to you both, as much as it's good to investigate, have a methodology to research and study all these scientific things that anybody should do, really, whether you're a scientist or not, about the Bible, it kind of boils down to the resurrection. If Jesus lived and died, what next? Like you said, Kevin. So that's as good a place as any to start, as much as we might get a bit bogged down with evolution, creation, miracles. Actually, what about this key moment in history about the person of Jesus of Nazareth? That is tremendous to look into that. Great resources. So maybe just a final few questions, chance for you to say anything else you think would be helpful. Are there any areas or questions that your faith answers that you think science can't address? Is it basically wrong question for the wrong area kind of territory? Anything particularly on that one?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about this kind of area in the previous podcast, and we talked particularly about the kind of idea that science is good at kind of answering the how questions, whereas faith is kind of perhaps more insightful for the kind of why questions, the kind of more meaningful ones. I think another thing that's also potentially interesting to look at is that when we kind of live out our daily lives, is that we need to kind of understand that science is good at telling us if we can do something, but actually there's also an important question about whether we should do something.
That's very helpful.
And this whole idea of kind of ethics is absolutely critical within science. When we do research projects, we have to go through an ethical procedure to say whether we should do that. And I was actually reflecting on this recently because I was listening to a podcast discussion between Jordan Peterson and John Lennox, and Jordan Peterson brought up an example from a book that he read from a previous KGB agent who's working in Soviet Russia, who was part of a program where they were trying to develop a hybrid of Ebola and smallpox, and actually as a result of this, accidentally some would be aerosolized and released, and a few hundred people had died. It was horrific kind of events, and thankfully, of course, the program came to an end before it was utilized and more broadly. But I think that highlighted, and the point he was trying to make, that as a ethical scientist, you could ask the question, can we make a hybrid? Yes. And if you're just looking purely at the kind of scientific kind of mind look, can we do this? Well, yeah, we can. But the more important question is, should we do this? And really, as an ethical scientist, it should be categorically no. We should not be doing this. But then that kind of pushes into the fact that, well, where does that come from? Where does the idea about what we should and shouldn't do as a scientist come from? So, and that those kind of moral grounding and this kind of reference point, I guess, if you think about it like that, it's a kind of transcendent reference, I believe, comes from God. And actually there's a lot of discussion and kind of research really that's looked into the kind of where this comes from. If you go way back, there has always been some kind of morals or ethics embedded within all societies across the whole world. And so science really can't give you a really good understanding of where that's come from, even in the kind of more social sciences. And again, there's lots of discussions on that as well. But that doesn't give you a really good understanding of why we know what is wrong and what is right and where that comes from. So yeah, I think that's
we can't find out that from studying our atoms, for example.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think using those simple questions is key, and then it maybe just moves us on to a final question for any other comments we have. Are there any areas of modern science that you believe people of faith may have a unique and potentially important perspective on? There's some big things happening in modern science, and if we branch out towards medicine or technology and AI and all sorts of stuff, we're getting into a huge field just right at the end of our podcast. But do you think science has any important perspective on that?
I mean, there's a couple of areas that I thought are particularly important. You mentioned AI, and I think really we are very much already living in the era of artificial intelligence. And there's one area of current research which is in the kind of areas of kind of genetic engineering and cyborg engineering with that kind of AI embedded into it. And there's a group of researchers that are effectively trying to, on a kind of long-term basis, solve this problem, in inverted commas, of physical death. And they are literally trying to create a way of elongating our lifespan and eventually, exist as a consciousness outside of what we now would consider our current bodies. Now, again, this comes back to the whole ethical thing we just talked about. What is that ethical? Is that right to do? And there's a huge danger, I think, in even when we don't even know to go to those extents, even just going along that path can be extremely dangerous. And I really think that this is where people with that kind of grounding, that faith perspective can actually weigh in and should weigh in to these conversations. I think it's really important. And I actually really like John Lennox's response to this, because he's actually talked a lot about AI quite recently. And in response to the kind of question is, how can we solve physical death? He says, well, you're too late. You're 2,000 years too late. It's already been solved. He just solved this problem when he died and rose again. Yeah. We don't need to worry about physical death anymore. Yeah. The answer's already there. So I think that's a really great perspective.
Yeah, really helpful. Great. Anything either of you would like to add as we finish? It's been really helpful to hear your perspectives as scientists, but also as Christians. That's your key identity, in Christ rather than in science. I've meant to avoid saying you're Christian scientists, because that might suggest something other than what you are.
Yes, sure.
So, any closing comments before we wrap up?
I don't know. I think the only thing I would say is that I think it really helps to have a kind of starting point that is kind of open to these questions. And so, and just particularly when we're talking to scientists, just try to kind of feel your way and just kind of try to get them to appreciate that there can be something that's bigger or greater than our own kind of human understanding and perspective. That is, I can think, almost the biggest hurdle. And if you can do that, and by living out our lives the way we try to do as Christians, and being consistent in that way, I think that's almost the kind of way into having these bigger conversations about more technical things, maybe in the sciences. So I think it's not just about, the head knowledge. It's all about that lived experience and trying to think of ourselves as someone that we have a unique perspective in a certain extent in comparison to maybe the current cultural perspectives that are current, and try to just to live that out and then use that as an example to kind of have these discussions.
Right.
And as Christians, we're not alone. We have the Holy Spirit, and then we have the community of believers. And so if we have questions, we can approach God in prayer, and that way. But also we have people around us who may well have a lived experience that they can share with us about, their faith journey, and if they're Christians as well, how those two things interplay with one another. And as I said earlier, when I was mentioning, my thoughts about evolution and so on, if people want to talk to me, if you have questions about science and faith and you want to chat, then feel free to come and talk to me.
That's tremendous. So these
Yeah.
guys are very open to that, and I think at least we can finish on a note of that Holy Spirit led worship as such, because the study of science or the natural world, the human body, I took biology and chemistry, discovered I was very bad at chemistry, so I'm glad I'm not in your professions, but the human body has always marveled me, as it does most people. And one of the things it led me to was worship God with a greater wow factor, because as we look at how we're made and life in its many forms around the world that we live in, isn't that a reflection of the glory of God? The heavens declare the glory of God. The work of his hand is quite something. So thank you for what you've shared. Thank you for that. It's informed our minds and hopefully warmed our hearts a bit and helped us on in our faith, and hopefully began to equip us a bit more to engage in some good local resources online. And if you would like to find out more, do get in touch with us at Barton Church, or if you're in the church, speak to John, speak to Kevin. There's actually lots of scientists at Barton. I had quite a long list of people I could have asked, but ended up being those that are available and very able to. So next time you might get different scientists involved. But thank you for being with us. I hope you found that helpful, and do watch out for some of our future episodes coming up soon. Thanks a lot. Bye for now.